If you've ever heard about the Microsoft ecosystem, you've probably heard about the PowerShell language/shell. It's become a powerful feature of the Windows operating system. But this is a Linux conference, so you might be wondering, why are we talking about this? Well, PowerShell has been open sourced and gone cross-platform. Today, Kieran Jacobsen is here to tell us more about this. Kieran has been working at Telstra Purple and various other very large enterprises, and has also been involved in community building in the PowerShell space by creating the planetpowershell.com site. After the talk, Kieran is going to be able to answer some questions, and that's going to happen in the post-talk Q&A chat. So use the question tab to write up your questions, and our moderators will make them available in the chat. Kieran, it's great to have you here.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to my session, PowerShell and Linux. The aim of this session is to work through some of the new features of PowerShell 7 and 7.1, looking a little bit towards PowerShell 7.2 as well, and seeing how they can really help you start to work with PowerShell in a cross-platform way. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. So I'm just going to start with a little bit about me. As said in the introduction, my name's Kieran Jacobsen. I've been working with PowerShell and involved in the community for around 15 years now. Ever since the technical preview programs for PowerShell started back when it was codenamed Monad. PowerShell and the Linux community have really made a significant impact on my career over those 15 years. I'm passionate about automation of both technology and business processes, and I really believe that automation can reduce the chances of errors in our environment, and it allows IT professionals to focus on what matters to the business. And importantly for me, I see automation as being one of those cornerstones for building highly secure organizations and environments. My interest in PowerShell and solving problems with PowerShell is actually how I ended up working for a company called Redify. We were acquired by Telstra and we're now called Telstra Purple. My involvement and participation in the PowerShell community has led me to receive a Microsoft MVP award in their cloud and data center category. That's a category that is all about how you deliver solutions across both sort of on-premises environments and into the cloud. As I said, the Linux community is something that's really driven, and the open source community has driven my career, and I'm really excited to be presenting here today. It's really a great honor. And it was this sort of Linux community and the open source community that at some of the early Linux conferences I attended, but also sort of working with Linux administrators as a Windows system administrator, that I started to really pick up this sort of want and drive around automation. And it was looking at how a lot of Linux administrators scripted installs and did a lot of scripted workflows that's opened my eyes to how much of a difference automation can make to the day-to-day lives of system administrators and engineers. So it does sort of feel a bit strange to be presenting about something that was once a proprietary piece of software to a conference like this one. And so why should you, as an attendee of linux.conf.au, get excited about PowerShell? And I could talk about, the differences between PowerShell and Python or Bash. I could talk about the noun-verb syntax of PowerShell, how PowerShell allows us to open doors for traditionally Windows teams, to start moving towards using, Linux and open source technologies. How PowerShell allows Linux administrators to more effectively manage those sort of pesky little Windows servers and clients that you might have running around in your environment. And these are all really great reasons, but one of the big drivers for me is just the sheer sort of volumes we're starting to talk about when we actually look at Linux, PowerShell on Linux, and also how the open source community is really driving a massive cultural change in Microsoft. So the big surprise is really around the usage of PowerShell on Linux. And this usage, it's really mind-blowing. And not just to me, but those in the PowerShell community, MVP community, and also to Microsoft in a lot of ways. When they first announced that PowerShell was being open sourced, I was kind of worried that PowerShell on Linux might be a bit of a non-starter. It wasn't really going to be picked up, and maybe it might end up being a bit of a dead end. But that's really not what's happened. Microsoft in PowerShell 6 and 7 has some telemetry where they can get some reporting on usage patterns of PowerShell. It doesn't include 5 or 5.1, so it's a little bit sort of biased, but it's focused on those open source releases. And this telemetry gives us a really excellent view on the consumption of PowerShell. These numbers here on the screen right now is for November, and you can see that Linux accounts for a lot of activations, that is PowerShell being started. That's 55% of all PowerShell 6 and 7 launches are on Linux. And the margin between Linux and Windows is 13 million. So there's 13 more million starts or activations or launches of PowerShell on Linux than there is in Windows. But this keeps growing. These numbers keep growing. In December, these numbers shoot further ahead, and Linux usage actually grows 5 times faster than it does on Windows. We started 20 million times more on Linux than Windows. And so that's just astounding growth. And this isn't once off. This isn't just for November and December. We see this pattern pretty much repeating itself month on month since PowerShell 6 was initially launched. Side note, the Mac OS numbers don't really make sense to me here. It seems low and it's going down. I suspect that maybe Mac OS users maybe are turning off the telemetry, or maybe they're using Docker images or something, so there's some false positives there. I'm not sure. But of course, the question is, where's all this usage coming from? And who's using and starting all of these workloads? And really, sort of the community theory, and probably the best theory that I know of, is that it's coming from public cloud providers. It's coming from AWS and it's coming from Azure. And this is where Linux in the cloud and open source products have really started to drive a revolution in Microsoft. And I think we've all seen this sort of image, the Microsoft Hearts, Linux image. And I think we could all be a little bit cynical when we see this at first. But the truth is that Microsoft really does love Linux. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And there's a lot of reasons why Microsoft is embracing Linux and open source software, from security to collaboration to the amazing community behind it. In a way, and this is sort of my own opinion, is that this community has been able to force Microsoft to really realize the value of Linux and open source to businesses and to the market as a whole. And Microsoft seeing this as not just good for the industry, but it also makes financial sense. After all, Microsoft is a for-profit business. And when we look at this, supporting PowerShell on Linux, it helps Microsoft sell their Azure cloud services. And so it makes sense for Microsoft to support people deploying, managing, and interacting with their cloud platform from a variety of platforms. Linux and open source is really a dominant player in Microsoft Azure. More than half of the virtual machine cores that are running in the Azure cloud are actually running Linux workloads. More than 60% of the Azure Marketplace images, this is sort of like a place where you can find pre-made virtual machines and virtual appliances. More than half of those images, they're running, 60% of those, are running Linux. Then you've got the growth of containers, and that's causing even more growth in the cloud, Microsoft Azure, And that's sort of further establishing this foothold and this change within Microsoft. So Microsoft's gone all out on Linux. They're really here to stay. I don't see them doing an about face on this. So what we can do is really start to make the most of their investment and really start to leverage what they've done for us as a community. Let's look at some lifecycle stuff at the moment. I'm the head of IT for Telstra Purple. I have to make a lot of decisions around technologies and products and whether one is a good fit for us or not. So I often look at things like, what's the release cycle? How often are updates released for a product or a technology? How long is a release supported for before we have to upgrade it to ensure that we remain under support? What operating systems, what distributions are supported? So let's take a look at this for PowerShell. PowerShell, before it went open source, followed a release cycle that is very much tied to operating system releases, so Windows clients and servers. It took a lot of time for a new feature or update, a new feature to really land for users to be able to make use of. But now, since becoming open source, PowerShell's following a significantly faster release cycle. One that's sort of more expected of your core DevOps tools. It's got major releases every 6 to 12 months, and then we've got minor releases on a sort of 3 to 4 monthly basis. The release cycle's getting faster, but how long are these releases being supported for? Microsoft's official position is that with PowerShell 6 and 7, that they're going to be supported by their own sort of internal support teams under their current agreements, and of course then as part of the community support model they've set up. With PowerShell 7, the life cycle of support has been tied to the underlying .NET framework that's distributed with PowerShell. So PowerShell 7, that's considered a long-term servicing release, an LTS release. It's running on on .NET Core 3.1. .NET Core 3.1 is going to be supported until December. It was released in December 2019, and it'll be supported until December 2022. So that's the time frame for PowerShell 7 support is through to December 2022. PowerShell 7.1, on the other hand, that's considered a current release. It's not an LTS release. Current releases of PowerShell are supported for 3 months after the release of the next current version or the next LTS version. PowerShell 7.1 is projected to be supported until February 2022. So that means we're sort of looking at PowerShell 7.2 being released around sort of December of 2021, so December this year. Another thing that some people don't realize, you need to keep up with the latest patches. So if you're running PowerShell 7.1, you need to actually have upgraded to PowerShell 7.1.1 to ensure that you're supported as well. Supported platforms and operating systems. There's a wide range of Linux distributions out there that are supported officially by Microsoft, and then there's some that are community supported as well. In terms of just out of interest around telemetry, Red Hat Enterprise 7 and Ubuntu count for about a third each in terms of usage. There's no sort of breakdown into individual Ubuntu versions, but as you can see, there's sort of the two that a lot of focus and energy is being put around supporting. Just quickly, if you want to know what versions and of platforms and operating systems and distributions aren't supported, there's a list here. It's pretty obvious they're the ones that are really no longer being supported by their vendors. So now that we've talked about some of the boring stuff around support, let's start looking at some more of the interesting concept. Let's see what's new in PowerShell 7 and 7.1. I really do think that with PowerShell 7 and 7.1, if you haven't started the journey, and looking at PowerShell, this is the right time to do it. There's a whole bunch of new things that have been introduced that are going to make your life easier. You're not going to have to really start to learn all of the old ways of doing things. you can just sort of start to pick up some of these new tools and go with it, and it'll be sort of a lot easier experience and learning path. PowerShell 7's been a really significant release to the community. It builds upon a lot of the feedback that we received, and both as a PowerShell sort of community, but also Microsoft received as well. It's delivered a lot of quality life improvements. There's some new operators, some new language features, a lot of stuff that's come across from some of the other scripting languages and formal programming languages. PowerShell 7.1 introduces some improvements around web services and API interaction. A lot of the sort of web stuff is actually being driven by the community and not by the core PowerShell team at Microsoft. 7.2 is currently under development. It's going to be a major code cleanup. It's going to have some notable bug fixes and improvements, but it's really around that code cleanup and code quality improvements. So in PowerShell 6 and 7, there's this concept of experimental features. They're not ready for production. The design hasn't been finalized. They're off by default. When an experimental features design is ready to go, is finalized, then it's made mainstream, and then it's on by default. In this talk, I'm only looking at sort of mainstream features of 7.1. However, there's a few features like PS command not found suggestion, PS use abbreviation expansion, and PS ANSI rendering that I recommend you take a look at if you're starting to play around, because they do bring some really cool features into PowerShell. So pipeline parameterization is one of the first things I want to talk about. A common task for us is to go off and run a command on a number of servers, network devices, maybe workstations. And these scripts can take a long while to run as they connect. They'll perform some action, disconnect, move on to the next device. Sort of like being in a supermarket where there's only one checkout open. There's a massive line of customers and people are getting tired of waiting. Wouldn't it be great if we could have one script that's actually performing these workloads on multiple devices at the same time? It'll shorten how long our script takes to run. And it's sort of like opening up more checkouts at the supermarket, so we're processing more customers. In earlier versions of PowerShell, the for each object, the for each object commandlet really only supported serial execution, so one at a time. We'd have to go and use third-party PowerShell modules or PowerShell workflows to get that parallelization. Now in PowerShell 7, this functionality is available to us by default. We just use the parallel parameter to tell PowerShell to execute this script block in parallel. By default, it's going to have 5 parallel jobs. You can actually sort of change this number up and down as you'd like. As a sort of really non-scientific example, the one I've got here on the right, I've got a list of IP addresses and I'm just trying to ping each one. It's a subnet that doesn't exist on my network, so shouldn't get any responses back. When I ran that as sort of a serial process, that took over 8 minutes to complete. Using pipeline parallelization, it took under 2 minutes. Completely unscientific, but you can start to see why this is really beneficial for improving the performance of our scripts. Next big improvement is the introduction of a ternary operator. It simplifies our if-else statements down. It's modeled very closely from like C#. Basically, we've got our syntax condition. If that condition or expression evaluates to true, then it'll execute the command that's directly after the question mark. And if it results to false, then it'll be the far right command there that's after the colon. The ternary operator really helps us reducing some of these if statements like the one that you see on the screen at the top. Especially with cross-platform scripts, we spend a lot of time going, is this on a Linux machine? If then I'll do this. Is it a Windows machine? I'll do that. And so using the ternary operator just helps shrink that down from 5 to 8 lines, depending on where you put your braces, down to basically 1 or 2 lines. And that's a really significant improvement for us. After that, the next operator that's been introduced is the pipeline chaining operators. And these are similar to AND and OR in Bash or ZSH. Previously in PowerShell, we could chain multiple commands together, but we didn't have any control over saying, if I'm chaining this command and then another command, I only want that second command to run if the first one was successful or if the first one wasn't successful. These two new operators allow us to do that in a really sort of powerful way, and we can actually combine those two together, as you can see in that bottom of example where we run SSH keygen. If it's successful, then we'll view the contents of the generated key. If it's not, we'll write that error message out to the screen. This one isn't something I think we'll see in a lot of scripts or modules. It's more of a sort of quality of life improvement for those that are running sort of interactively on the screen. Working with Null is one of the big areas that has had a lot of focus and a lot of sort of operators and things trying to improve the experience. And a lot of these come from the more traditional formal programming languages. It's really sort of common for us to want to sort of look at an expression or a variable, and if that returns as that's null, that variable is null, or that expression returns a null value, to perform some action. And this could be situations where we're looking to see if a particular PowerShell module is installed, and if it isn't installed, then we might go and install it from the PowerShell gallery. And the example here, this is a syslog module that I maintain. One of the gotchas when we work with Null and PowerShell is, due to the way that PowerShell casts from left to right, there's some tricks, some gotchas. Intuitively, you'd want to sort of put your expression or your variable you're testing on the left-hand side, but because of this casting process, if you do so, the results might not actually occur as you'd expect. So to protect us, we basically follow a best practice where we put the null value on the left-hand side of the comparison operator that we're using. It works, and it prevents us from seeing these issues, but it makes code really hard to see. Things like the null coalescing operator, they simplify 3 or maybe 5 lines with all this if statement complexity down to something that's easier to remove. It's removes the chance of errors and really does sort of make it easier to read a lot of scripts. And this is one that I do think we'll start to see in a lot of sort of scripts and modules. But that's not all when it comes to working with null values. We've also got the null conditional assignment operator. We often have times where we've got a variable. If it's null, then we want to assign some value to it. And so with the null conditional assignment variable, we don't need to put all of the if statement logic in there. We can just use this operator, and if that variable is null, then we'll assign whatever the expression on the right evaluates to. So PowerShell will evaluate that expression on the right and assign the result of that expression to the variable if it determines that variable is null. That's another one of these things that just sort of makes it easier to read, reduces the amount of code we're writing, and of course avoids some of these casting errors. But there's one more null related operator, and that's the null conditional member access operators. These allow us to work with an item that might be null and still call properties and methods. And it reduces the amount of this checking again. It improves the readability again. And the reason that we use this one is because there's a lot of workflows where we might go and retrieve an item, and if it exists, we perform some action on it. And one that I see a lot is when you're working with, say, Windows services, you might want to see if a service is running before you touch the files for it. And if it is there and the service does exist, we'll call it to stop. Otherwise, we're just going to start with the install if it's not if that service doesn't exist. If we don't have an if statement there going, hey, is this, is this variable, is this object null, before we try and call .stop, we'll get one of the pesky little, errors that's saying that, we've tried to call a method on an object or value that's null. If we wrap it around with and use the null conditional member access operators, then we can reduce down the need to add all of these checks in place. It's kind of weird that we've got the variable in those curly braces, as you can see. That's because we just need to be able to make sure that PowerShell understands that we're talking about a variable there. It's sort of just a quirk of PowerShell. So as you can see, this is all about sort of reducing the quality of life of when we're trying to make these scripts and automate these workflows where we're doing a lot of things that something might be null, but we still need to take action or handle that input. Let's sort of move away from talking about working with nothing and take a look at errors. The improvements to how errors are displayed in PowerShell is probably the biggest change that most users from previous versions will actually see. PowerShell 7 introduces some new views to make that readability a lot better than it was. It was kind of troubleshooting and kind of daunting when end users or people trying to use your script saw error messages previously. There's two new error views. The first is concise view, and it's an enhanced view that's the default in PowerShell 7. It's essentially a more friendly day-to-day display. It's great for end users that might not have much in-depth PowerShell experience. We've got normal view. That's what we had in previous versions of PowerShell. And finally, we've got category view, and this lists the contents of the category info member of the exception object that's raised. It's probably the least friendly display and sort of view, error display out there, but it's really great for advanced users and when you're troubleshooting code and trying to sort of work out what's going on and debugging. Another improvement in PowerShell 7 is the introduction of the get-error commandlet. This provides all of the information that was already there about an error, but it puts it in a really easy to read format for the user. By default, it's only going to display the last error that's occurred, but you can actually say, show me the last 3 or 4 errors as well. The reason I like this commandlet is because in the past, I have to manually drill into the error and work out a lot of this information. Now I can just type get error and it saves me a lot of work. PS Temp drive, quickly talk about this one. Essentially, it allows us to very easily just say, I want to put something in a temporary location without needing to first work out what the operating system is and then work out where the appropriate temporary location is. It reduces the amount of code that's being written and the chance of errors. It just streamlines writing these sort of cross-platform, cross-operating system scripts and workflows. HTTP error codes. This is where, if you wanted to ask me what's the most important change in PowerShell, what's the biggest improvements, and what are the biggest improvements driven by the community, then it's around web interaction. All of this has been driven by a couple of members of the community and not by the Microsoft PowerShell team, and they've made a huge difference in terms of a huge improvement in terms of features and the performance of these commandlets. One of the biggest changes is around how PowerShell handles HTTP error status codes. Normally, if it gets a HTTP 200 status, the two main commandlets, invoke web request and invoke REST method, will return various, the body of the request and various information about that request. But when PowerShell gets an error, it actually stops processing the request and the response and sort of throws that in. It generates an error and throws it back to the calling code. In most cases, this behavior makes sense, but there are some situations where you might have a body of that HTTP response that actually has detailed information we need at. It might have an explanation as to why it's returning a HTTP 404 or a 500 instead of the 200 we might be expecting. In the example I've got here on the right, if I sort of talk to this theoretical API and the user exists, and they've completed their speaking session at linux.conf.au, and then it returns their statistics and feedback about their talks. If the speaker exists but they haven't completed their session, there's no statistics there. So the underlying API returns a HTTP status code of 404. But in the body of that response, it says that there's no statistics available. If the user completely doesn't exist, the person's not a speaker, it still returns a status code of 404, but this time that body message says that it couldn't find the user. With the default PowerShell behavior, it's just going to generate an error on those first two examples, and we're not going to get any information about that body back. We don't get the body of the response back when there's an error. In PowerShell 5 and older, to try and get at that, you had to use a stream reader and basically reread the response body to get that information back. 6 and onwards, some work and improvements were made so that the response body is actually found in the exception that's raised. Things are starting to sound easier. But with PowerShell 7, basically we move to another sort of level again. You can actually disable the generation of errors when a HTTP status code reveals an error. In that case, invoke REST method and invoke web request will process the content of the body and return it as if that request was successful. You can combine this by also specifying a variable to put the status code in. So now you can actually have your scripts go, okay, I'm going to hit this API, I'll look at the status code myself, and then I can look at the body to determine whether there's been an error or not. As someone that's spent a lot of time working with HTTP sites and APIs, this is a massive quality of life improvement. And it's really going to simplify down a lot of the web API work that I'm often writing. Another big change in sort of the website of PowerShell, PowerShell 7.1 actually introduces the ability for us to force these sort of web commandlets to use TLS 1.3. The support was there in the underlying framework, but it hadn't bubbled its way up to those PowerShell commandlets for us to sort of force to use that cipher suite. More importantly though, and especially for this audience, PowerShell 7.1 actually introduces a potential breaking change if you're running it on Linux. PowerShell 7.1, it's built on .NET 5, and that's really the source of this breaking change. With .NET 5, it now respects the OpenSSL configuration for the default cipher suites. If you haven't specified a default cipher suite using openssl.cnf, .NET on Linux actually uses a tightly restricted list of permitted cipher suites, and that only contains TLS 1.2 and 1.3. As PowerShell is all based on is running on top of the .NET framework, with this change, if you've got some PowerShell automation that's trying to talk to servers that only support TLS 1.0 or 1.1, then you're going to need to either include those legacy cipher suites in your OpenSSL configuration, or you can use the -SSL protocol parameter when you call those web commandlets to force .NET to use those older cipher suites. You can also use the .SSL protocol parameter to specify a set of cipher suites as well. So you don't just have to specify one, you can specify a set. So that's enough about some of the sort of core improvements in PowerShell 7. Let's see how we can start to make our PowerShell prompt a little bit more smarter, to make it sort of almost think one step ahead of us. So PSRedline has been an extension that's been bundled with PowerShell releases for a long while. PSRedline has been available since PowerShell 3. It replaces the sort of existing command line experience of PowerShell. It introduces a bunch of new features, including some that are more familiar to those using Bash and ZSH. PSRedline 2.1 now includes what's called predictive IntelliSense, and the goal of this is to accelerate the success of both new and existing users to PowerShell. It's sort of a concept that extends tab completion to really start to provide us with better suggestions around what command we might be looking for. The way it does this is the suggestions will appear as colored text following the user's cursor. So as you start to type, it's trying to help predict based on your history right now, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, what the command is that you're after. It's really about allowing us to sort of discover and find new commands and really just speed up our day-to-day work. PSRedline 2.2 is currently in beta, and that includes an extension model for this predictive text. So right now, as I said, 2.1, that's based on just your history. 2.2 allows us to provide sort of enhanced predictor providers that are often domain-specific tools. The first one that's already out in preview is for those working with Azure. The Azure Predictor will identify values and variables for resource group names, the locations of those resource groups, and then uses that for subsequent suggestions. When you start typing a command, it's going to look at sort of the context of the user's session, what objects and resources you've got there, to try and also help suggest things like the parameter sets and required and optional parameters that you might want. It also will provide a lot of information and a lot of sort of predictions based on some of the examples that are found in the Azure sort of reference documentation as well. And it's also still using that history functionality to improve the things that it's suggesting to you as well. If you're new to sort of PowerShell, especially and new to using the Azure PowerShell module, I'd really recommend giving the PSRedline 2.2 beta a go and installing the predictor. It just really helps get your head around all of the sort of commands and options that are there in the Azure PowerShell module. The last thing I want to talk to you about is when we start to sort of look at writing automation or business flows, one of the common challenges is how do we manage secrets? How do we manage the credentials to perform various actions against APIs or user accounts and things like that? There's been a lot of attempts to solve this problem over the years. Microsoft and a couple of members of the Microsoft PowerShell team really set about trying to solve this issue. And they spoke to a lot of people in the community as they were doing it to try and work out how best they could solve it. And so what they've come up with and what they've now got available to us is what's called the secret management module. And this helps us by providing a common set of commandlets to use when we work with secrets and the vaults that hold our secrets. They have spent a lot of time making sure that this sort of framework that they've come up with is extensible. And it supports both having local vaults on your machine and also remote vaults that might be from some sort of shared provider. We can integrate new vault providers really easily. We just download and install the module that includes their support, and then we just register the module as required. This module is cross-platform as well. So you can write some logic and know that, as you move across platforms, as long as there's access to the vault and the vault has the right secrets in it, your scripts will work. At this time, secret management is what's called a go live release. That basically means it's a release candidate, but it's considered to be feature complete, and it's considered general availability quality. If there's no bugs, then there's no issues found, this module will be released to general availability. It'll become production in about sort of 2 or 3 weeks. They're saying sort of maybe February. The really sort of core thing for me is I'm going to be able to write scripts that then I can hand over to somebody else, maybe in my organization, maybe not. And I don't need to change the script whether they're using LastPass, a local vault, or 1Password. I don't need to go in and work how the script functions based on the fact that that vault provider has changed. I've got an example up here on the screen right now. I'm just registering a new vault using the Microsoft sort of first vault provider, which is called Secret Store. When I first try to use the vault by trying to get or set a secret, I need to specify a password for that vault. I can then create and retrieve secrets as I'd like. If I go and open a new PowerShell window and try and work with that vault, then it's going to prompt for that password. This sort of the Secret Store vault is tied to the user context as well, so it's kind of pretty locked down. I can then, using the PowerShell, I can create secrets. I can retrieve the secrets as well. By default, even though I've pushed in a string using set secret, get-secret will return that secret to us as a secure string. This follows PowerShell best practice and .NET best practice. Secure string is basically an encrypted string so that no one can try and read your string except for what you want to. If you do need to get that back to a plain string, I've included an example there as well of how you can convert a secure string back to a string, because sometimes that's not as obvious to people. So where can we store our vaults and secrets? There's already 11 extension vaults, one by Microsoft, as I said, Secret Store, and then there's others provided by the community. In 1 or 2 cases, these are actually Microsoft employees in their spare time have written and maintained these vaults. The Secret Store by Microsoft, it's using the .NET Crypto APIs to encrypt the file contents, and all of the contents remains encrypted in memory, and it's only decrypted when the user actually requests a secret out. It's supported across Secret Stores, supported across all platforms, Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. As I said, requires that password protection, but you can turn it off if you want. What I love about this is that the open source community has seen a gap. They've seen that Microsoft's created this thing, and now we want extension vaults for KeyPass and LastPass and HashiCorp, and even Keybase, something called Pleasant Password Server, or the Chromium Password Manager, and it's gone in there and filled that gap. And that's one of the things I really love about the open source community. We see a gap, we try and ensure that it's filled, and that people's needs are met. So just before I finish up, I want to talk quickly around what Planet PowerShell is. Planet PowerShell was something that I put together a few years ago, and it's based on ideas like Planet Xamarin as well. Planet PowerShell is an aggregator of community-written PowerShell content. Anyone can go in and request a blog to be included. We've got blogs from all around the world, and they're all PowerShell related, but on a wide range of sort of related topics and concepts. If you're learning about PowerShell, this is a really great resource. You can subscribe to it via your RSS reader, Twitter, or Facebook. People are talking about running, PowerShell on Linux and Windows and Mac OS and all sorts of things in between. I really recommend that you check it out. That's all for me today. I really want to thank you all for joining me today. As we said, we'll be, I'll be in Venulus late, after this, so that we can answer some questions. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or my website, poshsecurity.com.
Thank you, Kieran. That was great. I have to say that get error commandlet looks like a huge time saver.
It is a massive one.
Yeah, let's not keep you here. Let's get you over to that post QA chat channel so you can participate in the conversation. I can see that there are some questions for you to have a crack at.